Hi, my name is Abigail Toal. I'm the project coordinator at Mite.org. Our mission is to go above and beyond to show donors how their money is used in the field. Earlier this year, I had the incredible opportunity to go to Liberia and meet with the civilians that live in Liberia. And during our time there, we heard many stories about the Civil War conflicts that happened during the 1980s through the early 2000s. And recently, I was able to connect with Teun Voeten, who was a photojournalist that was there during the conflicts in 2003. And he has been he's blessed us by being willing to come on and do an interview. So, Teun, can you introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and also what you do?
Yeah, hello, my name is Teun Voeten. I'm a cultural anthropologist and a war photographer. I live partly in New York, partly in Brussels, Belgium. I was in Liberia in 2003. I was on assignment for Vanity Fair magazine together with the writer Sebastian Junger. I had been before in West Africa in Sierra Leone, which is the neighboring country of Liberia, and these conflicts are very much intertwined in Sierra Leone. I was nearly killed by child soldiers. I had to hide in the bush for a couple of weeks. I made it out alive. I went back a couple of more times to write a book on the Civil War, and that's how my interest and also my expertise started in the Civil War in West Africa, Sierra Leone and Liberia, especially the issue of child soldiers.
Mhm. And can you tell us, before we get started specifically about talking about the Liberian conflicts, can you tell us some other countries you've been to and other projects you've been able to take on?
Yeah, well, and since 1999, I started to photograph war and conflicts. I was started in Nicaragua during the Contra War. I was in Yugoslavia, the ex-former Yugoslavia. I was in Rwanda during the genocide, and a couple of times after that, I was in Iraq. I was in Afghanistan. I was in Syria, the whole Arab Spring, Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, Angola, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and was in Libya during the Civil War. I was in Mexico. I was in Colombia. I actually got my PhD on the Mexican drug violence, and recently I was in Ukraine. So I've had my share of wars so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like you've been almost everywhere. That's incredible.
Yeah, I was in a lot of conflicts raging the last 3 decades.
Hmm. So you said that when you were in Liberia, you were on assignment with Sebastian Junger. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Yeah, I was on with Sebastian Junger, the best-selling author of The Perfect Storm.
Awesome. And you
Yeah,
guys were there for Vanity Fair.
yeah, we were there for Vanity Fair, and we were doing a story on one of the most brutal civil wars at that moment, at that time. And basically, you had the president, Charles Taylor. He was one of the former warlords. The country was basically split and ravaged by three or four rebel factions. Charles Taylor was at one point the most victorious. He had the most money, he had the most international support, criminal support, and he was able to become president. And while we were there, his incredibly corrupt regime was being challenged by two rebel movements who are basically just as corrupt. But the whole country was in. I've been in many countries that are called failed states, but this was truly a failed state with
Mhm.
no electricity, no security, checkpoints with guys with guns on every corner who could do whatever you want. And then one time we saw a column of the president coming through town. And this was like basically a parade of thugs and criminals. People were very much intimidated by him. We had a very interesting trip for about 7 days, but then we ran into a little bit of trouble because Charles Taylor was rumored to engage in cannibalistic rituals. And in some of the folk beliefs in West Africa, eating body parts of your enemy gives you power, which actually it exists as an anthropologist. I know it exists in other parts of the world as well. And there were two British journalists who had written a piece on Charles Taylor and accused him of being a cannibal. But these journalists were so smart as to publish the story once they got safely back in the UK. But for some reasons, the authorities thought that me and Sebastian had written that piece. So we were hunted down, and we were at one point we were expelled by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But the thing was, we could not leave the country because the airport was closed and the whole country, the capital, was besieged by rebels. So it was for a couple of times a very hairy situation, especially for my buddy Sebastian. He was an American. I carried a Dutch passport, but there were rumors that there was a American warship just off the coast that would invade and kick out Charles Taylor. So basically, they were on the hunt for Americans as well. So it was a very bad situation. And well, we got our photos, and then at that point we said. As a war journalist, you should know when you have enough material. You should never become greedy. Once you have enough material, we have the saying, excuse my language, get the pigs and get the fuck out. You don't overstay. Once you have enough material, it's time to pull out of Dodge. And we were somehow able to drive out with a convoy with the help of the US embassy. And we made it out safe with all our stories and all our film. At that time, you didn't have digital cameras. I was still shooting on film. But it was a very interesting experience. And if I look back at the photos I took, I think I was able to document the whole savagery and the madness and the cruelty and the insanity of this civil war, and it was actually one of the most brutal civil wars I have ever seen in my life.
I remember I was reading that journal, or sorry, that article. It's titled Liberia's Savage Harvest, right?
Yeah, that's the name of the article. Yeah, yeah.
So I was reading about reading about y'all's time there and how they started suspecting you guys of being spies. And that was insane. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat. Insane story.
No, I mean, right now it's 20 years later, and right now me and Sebastian we can laugh about it, you know.
Yeah.
We are not like older guys, like nearly grandfathers, and we can. Hey, do you remember that time back in Liberia? But at that time, it was actually very hairy, you know.
Mhm.
And we were ready. We already talked to the U.S. embassy. We explained them our problem, and we told them, "From listen, if it is stuff really gets out of hand, and the embassy people are very friendly, they said, listen, if you guys really are in a shit creek, you always can come here for safety."
Mhm.
But fortunately, we could manage ourselves.
That's good. So quoting from the article, when describing Monrovia during the time that you guys were there, Mr. Junger said, if there was ever a nightmare vision of a future world overpopulated, overarmed, and run by gangster states, Monrovia is it. Would you be able to describe for us some of the scenes that you saw that added to this description of Monrovia?
There was no electricity. People lived in destroyed homes on the beach. Actually, by the way, a beautiful beach. People lived in squatted buildings with giant holes in the floor, and there was no electricity at night. Everything was dark. People squatted also in an empty building. And you could see that once it would have it was a very prosperous town, but it was totally run down. And then you had all these guys with guns driving around in cars, in really fancy cars. So they had all the money, and
Mhm.
they just did whatever they want. And then the most horrifying scene was the convoy of the president, which looked like a show off, basically to show from, listen, I'm in charge.
Mhm.
And his bodyguards, they were the most scariest thing, because these bodyguards, they were just criminals. And then we went on one trip when we were still friends with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We went to an excursion 200 kilometers outside, or a 3 hours drive, at the border town that had just been captured from rebels. And there you saw children from 9, 10, 11, 12 years walking around with guns. And they were very friendly, but most of them, they looked like they had been totally drugged
Mm,
and drinking palm wine. And these are the most dangerous kids, because at one point they can be friends, at one point they can become enemy. And when we were there, some of the people heard the rumor that we might have been the journalists that had offended the president. And these were, mind you, this was not some ragtag army of rebels. These were official government soldiers from the president. And I can remember two really beautiful girls. They had guns as well. And in most of these civil wars, for a woman, in order not to get raped or robbed, it's better to join an armed group themselves.
mm,
And, I was amazed to see, especially these two young girls. It's on a photo of mine. They looked very vulnerable, but at the same time very fierce. And the young kids with the guns, the same way. They looked very childish and vulnerable, but at the same time, you know, these kids can just kill for no reason.
right.
Especially, I've been in many war zones around the world, and the same as in Sierra Leone, it's very difficult to discuss with child soldiers who have no commander, who just do whatever they please. And if you give a kid of 12, 13 years a gun, you give him some drugs and some booze, he becomes like a totally unpredictable killing machine.
Hmm.
He can be very friendly and cute and childish, but he can also be very cruel and unpredictable.
Right.
And that was the scariest thing of the whole trip.
Yeah. That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, it was a nightmare, but yes, again, it's tough work, but I'm very privileged. I can see these things firsthand, you know.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, so y'all were in the capital when, well, so sorry, when y'all first arrived, you arrived days after the rebel forces had signed a ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire deal, right?
Yeah, but these ceasefire deals papers, they're like toilet paper. They were nothing.
That's horrible. So you guys were in the capital when, like you said, the ceasefire deal ended up being for nothing and the rebel forces decided to advance on the capital.
Yeah, and they were shelling the town, and actually it was very sad. A lot of people had taken refuge into in town from the outskirts. But there, they in a one refugee camp of internally displaced peoples, a couple of grenades shells landed, and you had like 15 dead people and a lot of wounded people. And
Mhm.
and we were there. Just we were actually on our way to that refugee camp, and if we had arrived 5 minutes earlier, we would have been shelled.
Right.
But we were able to take photos, and later on, all these dead bodies there were strewn out in front of the American embassy as a way of protesting from the police. America intervene.
Hmm. You guys were you guys were actually there when the Greystone complex next to the American embassy was attacked, right?
Yeah, that was I think that was the Greystone complex. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And do you remember? I couldn't find in the article exactly. It seemed like there was some confusion on whether it was being attacked by the rebel forces or the government militia. Was it clear when you guys were there?
There was some. I think it was shelled by rebel forces,
Mm,
and but everything is very fluid in such. This is not like a very organized army where orders are given and executed, and
mhm,
there is a logbook of what unit fires what grenade at what time. This is complete anarchy, and people fire at random shells, and they don't have any exact clue where these granites will land.
Hmm. And through that, from that attack, hundreds were wounded, and then there were fatalities.
Well, I think there were like 12 or 15 fatalities, and a couple of dozens were wounded. And one of the photos I showed, it's a
Right.
wounded man in a wheelbarrow being driven to a Doctors Without Borders medical post. And
Um,
we were at the post and we saw people at the medical post of Doctors Without Borders, and we saw people with horrible wounds. And some people you knew from this guy won't make it to the operation because he has a shrapnel in his neck and hitting some arteries, and he's bleeding to death when we were standing.
and the people that were wounded were civilians, unarmed civilians, right?
Unarmed civilians, yeah, they were internally displaced people from the outskirts who had sought refuge to flee the fighting.
Hmm. Um, when I was reading the article, I kept on getting a sense that really the civilians weren't being protected. Well, they weren't safe from either the rebel forces or the people fighting for the government. It seemed like both sides were not, maybe not intentionally harming them, but it ended up being the case that they were harmed from both sides of the fighting forces.
Yeah, but it is a very special kind of war. In literature, it's called the New War. It's not a war between official states with official armies, but everything is fluid, and the distinction between civilians and combatants becomes very blurry.
Mm.
And civilians are deliberately targeted. In a classic war between armies, normally it are armies that fight it out on the battlefield. They soldiers kill soldiers, but here combatants kill civilians, civilians kill combatants, and combatants become civilians, and civilians will become combatants.
Mm.
And army people can become rebels, and in Sierra Leone, it was even so worse that soldiers were fighting the rebels during the day, but they joined the rebels during the night to loot. So you
Mm.
didn't know who was a rebel, who was a soldier, and who was a civilian. So
Yeah.
this is a totally new kind of war, which in the West we are not used to.
Hmm. But you have seen that type of war in the other countries that you've
Yeah, in Sierra Leone, in Afghanistan, just right after the Soviet withdrew, it's basically organized crime merges with war, and it becomes all very blurry, and it's all about uh, exploitation of natural resources. And in the case of Sierra Leone, it was diamonds. In the case of Liberia, it was tropical wood.
Hmm.
And of course, in the case of Colombia, it's cocaine, and in the case of Afghanistan, it's poppy leaves and opium. So you have a lot of warring factions um, that don't want to that want to keep on this continue this situation of war and anarchy because they can extract resources from the community and from the country, and so it's a whole different kind of war.
Hmm.
Basically, it's also the winner takes it all.
Hmm.
Uh, Charles Taylor, he was the most ferocious warlord. He won, and he was the president, and he had it all until he was arrested. And right now, he is serving a lifelong prison for human rights crimes.
And that's in Britain, right? He's serving in his prison sentence in Britain.
I don't know exactly, but I was at his trial in The Hague. I took photos of that for Vanity Fair as well.
Wow.
And then he looked like a very subdued gentleman in a very
Yeah.
nice suit. And you know how criminals can dress up and try to. But of course, he had been a ferocious warlord.
Yeah. This wasn't part of weren't part of my questions for the interview, but I in the article it states that he had involvement in both basically all the civil wars that were happening around Liberia before Liberia went started having their second civil war. And they found that his earnings from those civil wars were upwards of $75 million.
Yeah, that could well be. He was supporting the rebels in Sierra Leone as well,
Right.
because he had made a deal with the rebel leader there. It was for the diamond fields.
Mm.
So these they are warlords and crime lords, and they use their presidency and their political power to enrich themselves, of
Mhm.
which they pay off their supporters, and that's why they have popular support, and that's why how they can survive.
Right. So like you said, so on both sides of the fighting, neither forces are real armies. So even on the government side, a large number of the people that were fighting were unpaid teenage soldiers. Can you
Yeah,
talk?
but they were unpaid, but they paid themselves with looting.
Right. So can you talk about how they were incentivized? You already mentioned looting, how they were incentivized to join in the fighting.
Well, it's basically very simple. If you live in a war-ravaged country, you can become civilian. You can stay civilian, but then you run risk of being looted or killed or robbed uh, by any armed group, be it government soldiers or rebels. So for your own safety, it's better to join an armed group yourself
Mm,
than whatever is the most convenient. And in some cases, the combatants were kidnapped at a very young age. They were forcefully conscripted.
mhm.
They were brainwashed with drugs, and sometimes, in the case of Sierra Leone, they were forced to kill to make their first kill. And once you have made your first kill, the second kill it becomes easy.
Wow. I can imagine those being the only two choices I had.
Yeah, yeah, it's but you see that very famous tactic. You see that right now at ISIS, they force children to execute prisoners, and you see it also in at training camps of assassins for the Mexican cartels. They are forced to kill their enemies as well, captured enemies, and if they don't kill an enemy from a competing cartel, they are killed themselves.
Mm,
So it's a very effective tool to teach people how to kill.
mhm. You have covered numerous conflicts that involved child soldiers. I think your
Yes,
biggest one was in Sierra. I have the hardest time saying this.
one
Sierra.
was in Sierra Leone. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And you even wrote a book, right, about that project?
yeah. I wrote a book about my experience in Sierra Leone.
Right.
It's called How the Body, Hope, and Horror in Sierra Leone. It was also translated in the US.
Hmm. So can you kind of talk about how the involvement in child soldiers in these conflicts, like affects the dynamics of war?
Well, child soldiers, they're very cheap and expendable, and they can do the most dirty work. And actually, they were used in the war in the Middle East as well with ISIS. And in the horrible war in 1980s between Iran and Iraq, and they are used to as cannon fodder, basically to walk through minefields and check out where the mines are. And the thing with child soldiers is, first of all, they're very small. You don't have to give them too much to eat, and they're very happy with a couple of bucks. So they don't have grown-ups who want a decent salary.
Mm.
But the thing is, they don't know about danger. They think they are invulnerable. They don't think about dying. So they do. You can give them crazy assignments, and they will do it. You pump a little bit drugs in them, and
Mm.
they do whatever they want. And I talked to many child soldiers in Sierra Leone. I also read a couple of books, and basically, yeah, they give you drugs, and then with orders from the commander and peer pressure, you do whatever you need to do.
Right.
Uh, there is no logic, no sense, no conscience, and they don't have no fear of dying because dying is not a concept of being a combatant.
You kind of just hit on this a little bit with the using drugs, using the ability for them to have drugs as a way to control them. And
Yeah,
also it lowers their inhibitions, right? When they
yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
So, and I know that this is you have your life's work, a lot of it has been in um the complicate or the consequences of drug dependency on both individual users and also in socioeconomic, the socioeconomic implications. So
Yeah.
can we talk about how substances like alcohol, methamphetamines are used um, in these wars, in these
Well, basically, drugs have been used in every war since 3,000 years ago. It used to be a little bit of alcohol, and then, of course, you had the newer drugs. But in all wars, drugs have been used. And if I go back in recent time, the army from Napoleon, all the soldiers got like half a bottle of wine to get them through the day.
Mm,
And not too much, because if you're too drunk, you cannot shoot. But a couple of glasses increases your courage. And in the Second World War, it was very interesting. The Germans used crystal meth, methamphetamine,
mm,
and they were able to run 2, 3, 4 days non-stop, and that's what made the Blitzkrieg possible. But the Allied forces, the Americans, they used speed, the ordinary amphetamine, to basically to carry out bombing raids, because sometimes they had to spend 10, 12 hours in an airplane, you know. So basically all sides use drugs. And if you look at in Sierra Leone and in Liberia, it was called brown brown. It was a mixture of cocaine, amphetamine, a bit of marijuana, and a bit of gunpowder for some reason, because it dilates the blood veins, and it makes the absorption of drugs easier. And in what you see right now in Sierra, if in the Middle East, a lot of terrorists from ISIS, they use a captagon, which is it's also called the jihadi drugs, and there's also some form of amphetamine. And in Mexico, cartel killers are using cocaine, but also rofinol to calm yourself down. So basically, in all wars present, and there is a very good book, Shooting Up by Kamiensky, Drugs and Warfare, and it describes from I read the whole book. It's a pretty tough read, 500 pages, but it's very well documented how from 3,000 years ago up till now, in even this time, the US Army is experimenting with ability enhancing substances, all kind of drugs to that improve your cognitive capacities, but also your stamina. And so
mm.
they up to this day, it's still used.
Interesting. Um, can you also talk about how specifically for those child soldiers when I mean, I believe the substance use was an everyday thing for them, right?
Yeah, substance use everyday thing. Sometimes they got little pills, and but they also got like brown brown. It was called
Mm-hmm.
a little cut, and they poured in some powder, and they put it on a plaster. So you had a very slow absorption during the whole day.
And how did this help? How did these substances being in their system throughout the day help with them coping with the traumas of being in war at such a young age?
Well, people soldiers use drugs for two reasons. First of all, to become a better fighter, and second, to deal with that trauma. And that we saw a lot in Vietnam. A lot of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, they were using opium and marijuana, not to become better fighters, but basically to calm themselves down, to deal with the trauma.
Mm,
And but these drugs, the stimulant drugs, they were given exactly to the combatants, to the children, to make them into fierce warriors. And nothing was done to ease their trauma, as far as I know.
mhm.
And maybe the kid self-medicated themselves with a bit of palm wine and marijuana to calm down. But a lot of the time, these kids were just constantly on this drug.
So horrible,
Yeah.
heartbreaking. Um, and now I kind of want to, well, still talking about Liberia or just in general, your time in these really intense uh environments where there's pandemonium happening all around you. When you are there on assignment taking photos and it's just chaotic, how do you be like focus yourself and decide what's most important to capture in the moment?
Well, it's very difficult because you vary your on assignment, and you expect to come home with good photos. And in the beginning, I'm always nervous because the first days I never see guys with guns, and I was like, "Oh, Sebastian, man, we're already 3 days here and haven't seen any guy with a gun." And Sebastian, "Oh, don't worry, they will come sooner or later, more than you want." But basically, you focus in a conflict. You make a list what you in your head what you want. You want some refugees, you want destruction, but you also want combatants.
Mhm.
And basically, you just go out as much as possible. You talk to as many people as possible. You try to visit as many places as possible, within the possibilities of safety, of course.
Mhm. And when you are taking the photos of these people, you're not necessarily viewed as a friend, right?
Some no, some it depends. Some combatants look at you a little bit hostile. Some of you look at you pretty neutral, and some people they're very proud. They are documented, and someone has taken all the effort to come down from another continent to take their photos.
Right.
And some people even show up, show they like to show off with the guns.
When have you ever been in a situation where one of your subjects of a photo was starting to act in a hostile way towards you and you had to
Yeah,
de-escalate?
yeah, yeah, and then you immediately stop photographing,
Okay.
because if it's like, to put it very bluntly, if it's like a poor old lady, 5 feet and 80 years old, and she makes a problem, then it's no danger. But if you have a 7 foot guy with the M16 making a problem, you better listen to him, you know.
Right.
So you have to you always are in eye contact with the people, and you can see if people don't like that you take photos. And
Hmm.
sometimes you talk your way around. You take a photo of a group, and then one guy is not happy. Say, "Well, you were not on the photo because I took the photo from that angle, you know."
Okay.
And then sometimes they believe you, sometimes they don't believe. Yeah.
Um, are there any particular images and or stories from your time in Liberia during 2003 that you like think about often?
Well, I think the 4 kids on the truck, the photo you guys have, and also the wounded people in the wheelbarrow, because it was so yeah, it's so outrageous,
Right.
and brutal, and straight in your face. And I like to take sometimes sometimes my photos are a little bit aesthetic and subtle, but sometimes a photo should be violent and straight in your face.
Hmm. In the article, Mr. Junger talks about how when you guys were witnessing the Greystone complex attack and then started helping people or following them to the Doctors Without
Yeah.
Borders complex to get help. There was a moment where he said he had to sit down and he kind of just put his head in his hands and was thinking about like what he was experiencing that moment and how
Yeah,
overwhelmed it was.
it was so horrible because we saw people bleeding to death, and at one point we kind of we spent a very little time, you know, because in a couple of minutes I could take all the photos I wanted, and then we were basically walking a little bit in the way of the people giving aid and assistance. Then you know, well, listen, we take really quickly all the photos we need. We talk to one or two people very quickly, and
Mhm.
then we move out because we are not. It's better if we leave because we just disturbing the whole aid operation.
Right. So after experiencing something like that, you again went into not specifically into Liberia. They didn't have another civil war after that war, but you went into other war zones. How do you keep yourself? and the mentality of I'm willing to go risk my life and do this again?
I don't know, but I think it's very important stories. And I mean, right now I'm covering the violence in Mexico and the fentanyl crisis on the West Coast. That's pretty hairy and dicey too, you know. But I think these are important stories, and somehow, except for some instances where it really went wrong, let me knock on wood. I managed to do my thing, and but it's the attraction of coming at places where you should not be is very strong.
Mm.
Uh, because I want to report for what's going on in the world, and if I see horrible scenes, I saw these horrible scenes of people addicted to fentanyl in Philadelphia and then in the West Coast, and I said, "Wow, this is beyond belief," and I wanted to see that. I wanted to document it.
Mhm.
So the urge to go to these places, which are completely outrageous, is stronger than you fear, and you know basically if you be very careful and don't overdo it. Among war photographers, I have the reputation of being a bit of a careful guy,
Okay.
and I'm not going to hang out at the front line all of the time. And if a place has been just been captured, I wait one day. I'm not the one that goes in the first minute. I first want to wait if things are a little bit safe, you know. So I have a reputation of being a little bit on the safe side, you know.
Mhm.
And yeah. So I take risk, but like calculated risk. I'm not some kind of crazy fool.
Good. We're happy you're still here with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for your interest in my
Yeah.
stories.
One final thing, you kind of already touched on it. I wanted to see if you'd like to share about your next project.
Yeah, my next project is I'm work on it's called it's a book project. So I'm an anthropologist as well. I'm researching the fentanyl crisis on the west coast of the Americas, and America is for me from Canada uh, up down to Mexico.
Okay.
And in Mexico, it is produced. It is exported to San Diego, Tijuana, to US, and you have horrible centers of consumption in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and also Portland, and also Vancouver. So
Mhm.
I'm basically covering in these cities. I talk to addicts, I talk to aid workers, but I also look at the international relation. What is the role of China? China is selling a lot of precursors and even the pure fentanyl to the
Mhm.
West. Some people call it a kind of chemical warfare, and I also look at the role of the Mexican cartels and their production and how they are persecuted also by the U.S. governments. Because so it's a very it's a story with the global perspective, global context, China, Mexico, U.S., and also Europe, where fentanyl has been popping up, but also like a very local context. I talk to addicts, I hang out with them, I make friends with them,
Mhm.
and sometimes it goes very easy, and sometimes you always meet addicts or users that want to talk and that are eloquent and that really want to share their stories. It takes time, you know.
Mhm.
But and of course these fentanyl use, they look like zombies, but I try to give them a human face, you know, because they yeah, at one point they were like normal happy kids,
Right.
but they took the wrong turn at some point.
Mhm.
And some of them are amazingly eloquent, and I met some amazing nice people.
Mhm. I was reading, I think your bio on your website, and I don't know if it was in the 1980s or 1990s, but you spent 5 months in the tunnels in New York, right? With the
Yeah,
people.
I did a story on homeless people living in the tunnel in New York, and most of them were using crack as well. And the only way to make a good story was to live with them, and they totally accepted me as a foreign journalist. They thought I was funny. I had a funny accent. And I helped them to collect cans in the garbage, you know. So I was working with them, and so and I could tell crazy stories and good jokes. So I was an asset for the community. They liked me.
Mhm. That is so cool that you went and spent so much time with them.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm still very proud of that project, and the book is called Tunnel People, and it's still selling. It's not a bestseller, but it's a slow and steady selling. No, and I still consider it a very good journalistic and anthropological piece of work.
Very cool. Well, we are so thankful that you would share your photos with us. And also, I'm so grateful that you would be willing to answer my questions and tell me about your experience in Liberia.
Yeah,
And we wish you the best of luck on your next project. And thank you for doing that storytelling. We're huge fans of storytelling, both in written form and also through media. And so we're very thankful for what you do.
yeah. Thanks so much. And if you know what subjects I'm covering, so if you ever need me again, you know how to find me.
Absolutely.
Okay. Hey, thanks so much, Abby, and I hope you have enough